Welcome to the second video in the GIS Mesher series. If you want to build quality meshes in less time using your favorite GIS software, you want the GIS Mesher. This video picks up from the first one and explains some of the functionality of the GIS Mesher. The previous video introduced the GIS Mesher, set up a simple meshing project, and created a simple mesh, like the one that we see on the right. This mesh is very basic, doesn't add refinement near the channels, doesn't include roadways and other shapes of interest, and so it needs a little bit of work to be a useful mesh for a hydraulic model. This video is going to teach us how to control the shapes and sizes of the meshes. It teaches us how to create GIS files using the GUI, how we're going to scale the sizes for GIS layers. I'm going to use polylines to align cell edges and to create sizes for cells. And we're going to look at some of the methods that we can use to help do a little bit of basic troubleshooting and finding potential bad cells within the mesher. So we've got a lot to cover, so we'll go ahead and get started. We've got the GIS. We're using QGIS like we did in the first video, and it's all set up with the project that we had before, where we've got the DEM in the background. We've got a little stream, kind of two segments two streams come together. It has a couple roadways, a little bit of just an interesting little tutorial problem. This is based on the TUFLOW tutorial model. And so this was the mesh that we generated before, and now we want to make some tweaks to that mesh to make it better. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to make a copy of our tutorial file that we were working in. So we're going to go to our tutorial files. We've been working in this meshing folder, and inside of this meshing folder we have this tutorial 001, and I'm just going to make a copy of that, and we're going to create a version 2. Inside this version 2, this is where we'll make changes and additions. And the first change that we're going to make is we're going to scale. We have mesh points in here, and these mesh points we want them to be smaller. But rather than go in and change in the GIS layer, which we can do, we're going to just do a size multiplier. So we can see that size multiplier command. I'm going to put it in here twice, once so that I can put in 0.5, and then once to change it back to 1. So when the GIS Mesher runs, it hits this first size multiplier, which isn't going to do anything because it hits the second one. In fact, I'll go ahead and just comment out this first one. It's going to come along and it's going to hit the size multiplier 0.5. That's going to make all the cells sizes half as much as they would be. And then we're going to read in this GIS mesh points. All of those get that multiplier of a half. And then we're going to set the size multiplier back to 1. So in the end, we're going to have this command is only going to impact this one layer. So other layers that we have, we'll put in the size that we want to use. So that's the first thing that we want to do. Next thing we want to do is we want to create, if we look at our QGIS, we want to be able to make sure that our roads and our channels are being represented in the mesh. And so we're going to use polylines to be able to define how we want those meshes to be built in those areas. So first off, we're going to come over to our GIS Mesher, and we're going to create 2 GIS files for those. So they're going to be mesh polylines. We've already set up the Mesher GUI so that it knows where to create them in the right place. So I'm going to create one file here. shapes. I'm trying to remember what I want to call these, because it's got to, we want it to match what we're doing in a minute. So I'm going to create one that's going to be mesh poly panels 002. I'm going to create the file, and I'm going to create one that is mesh poly roads 002. We'll get to this other piece here in a minute, and I'm going to create the file. The log tells us that we created those files successfully, and so they'll be sitting there in that meshing folder. Go back to it really quick. My shortcut, sorry, meshing in the GIS folder. We're going to bring in this mesh poly channels and mesh poly roads. Now those are both be empty right now. Yep, mesh channel and road. So let's go ahead and do the channels, and in the channels we are going to make this editable, and we're going to create polylines that follow kind of the bottom of the channel. And I'm going to just click through this fairly fast. If you're doing this for a real model, maybe you'll spend a little bit more time trying to make sure you're capturing it accurately. We're just going to be doing this stream for now, and I'm just going to end it at this road. Now in this case, we're going to control the sizes of these polylines. So we're going to have this polyline, the cells along it, I'm going to make them 4.5 meters size in the parallel direction, and then perpendicular to those that polyline, I'm going to make the size 1.5 meters. Now if we put in a size para 2 and a size perpendicular to, that makes it define the sizes at the start and ends and transition between. But we're just going to use a constant 4.5 meters and 1.5 meters, and click OK. That color, let's change that color so we can see it a little bit. There we go, a little bit big and bold. And I'm going to turn on the boundary, make sure we want to make sure we're outside the boundary. We are. And let's go ahead and click out another line here on the other side of the channel. So we want to make sure that our mesh is capturing those channels. We want to have at least one cell wide in that area, maybe more, but this will get us a start. And I'm coming through, and I'll end it here at this road. And we're going to use the same sizes, parallel and perpendicular. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and digitize this road. Again, I'm going to turn on the boundary, make sure I'm kind of far enough. Well, let me save this one. And now on the road, I'm going to go ahead and digitize. Oops. Got to select the right tool here. I'm going to go ahead and digitize, starting from outside, digitize along the roadway. Again, you might do it a little more carefully if you're not doing it for a video recording. And we'll just clip past those channel lines, and we'll come down to this road, and we'll go ahead and end it there. In this case, on the roads layer, I'm not going to put any sizes. What that's going to do is it's going to use the edges, and it's going to align cells to that line that I created, but it's not going to force a certain sizing with those cells. So we're going to force a line, but not impact how the sizes are allocated. This is useful in this case because we just want to make sure that we've got one cell of edges along the road, and we're not going to worry about trying to control the overall sizes for the mesh in this location. So we'll just go ahead and click these out. As before. And there we go. Okay. So now we've got our 2 polylines for our road. I'm going to save that layer, and 2 polylines for our channel. Now to include those into our model, we need to have a command in our file. So I'm going to bring up our text editor. We've got the read GIS polylines command, and it's blank in here. This is the command was there from when we created the project, and it set up the skeleton for us. And so in here, I'm going to go ahead and do mesh poly roads 002 dot shape and read GIS mesh polylines, the same thing, but for the channels. Now these are not order specific. It doesn't matter which order they're in, but they're in there, and the latest size multiplier is going to impact, so we're going to have the size multiplier of 1, so they're going to be unchanged. So I went ahead and saved that. So that's the changes to our file. So now in our tutorial 2 file, it's going to come along, and we've changed what our sizes are, and we've changed our mesh polylines. One other change that we want to make on our mesh points before we had 2 points in the middle that were used to refine. We're going to remove those, so we're not going to do a refinement anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to export these features into a new file. And so I'm going to just name this mesh point 002 dot shape. Okay, so it's going to export those. I'm going to make it editable. I'm going to select those 2 points, and I'm going to click delete. And I'm going to save my changes. Now we want to change our mesh points command, so now we're pointing to that new layer that we created. Okay, so now let's go ahead and create our mesh. So we're going to run the mesher. We're going to come down here and find tutorial 2. If this combo box that tries to look for it, noticed that we had created a new file and added it to the list. If it doesn't, we can use this refresh button to put it in there. And we'll go ahead and click run to run the mesher. It's going to go through. We can see that it read the 2 polyline files that we created, and it's going to click along, and it runs in 7 seconds. So now we can go back to our files, go to our output folder, and there's a set of folders for tutorial 2. So let's go ahead and bring in our shapefile for tutorial 2. If we look down in here in the area that we're interested in, we can see along the channel we are following the edges of the mesh, or following along that channel. Similar with the road, they're following along the roadway. One of the things that can be useful to check out is aspect ratio. Sometimes if we get a really crazy cell, it'll have a really bad aspect ratio. Let's see if we ended up creating any in our case. If we open it up, our attribute table, the measure assigns a column named aspect ratio. And so the worst one is 3.88. And we can use our zoom to tool to find it. So it's right along there. 3.88 is not too terrible. I was kind of expecting perhaps we would end up with something a little bit further off in this area where we've joined that roadway layers and our channel, but it ended up working out for us. It depends on how those work. Typically, we'd want to snap those together, and because we didn't, it's kind of a gamble on whether or not that's going to create a problem for us. Well, now rather than than digitizing. So if it had created a problem, we could have just gone back and cleaned that up and fixed it. But that's something to watch for. Rather than trying to do all of these polylines, I'm just going to go ahead and bring in some that we generated before. So I've got these. Step 2, these are labeled 2B, which is why I wanted to make sure my other ones were control how my other ones were labeled before. So we'll bring those in and take a look at them. Oh, I ended up with accidentally brought them in multiple times. So let me remove those. And I'll go ahead and make our channels like they were before. And I'll make the roads, and I'll make it like that, just so we can see what they look like. So you can see that when these were created, they were carefully we carefully snapped so that we wouldn't have some of the potential for the problems that we had before. You know, it's a bit of a judgment call on how best these should be laid out in some of these locations. But these were laid out. Again, we snapped them. I think all of the mesh channels, all of the mesh channel polylines use a size of 4 in the direction parallel to the line and 1.5 meters perpendicular. And the roads aren't using any sizes. They're just aligning the locations. Okay. So let's go ahead and bring those into our editor. So we're going to just change our roads to B and channels. Oops, we're going to add B for the roads and the channels. And so go back over here to our GUI, tell it to run. And it'll work on generating the mesh. It has a lot more lines in here that it's trying to constrain the mesh to. And so it's going to take a little bit longer for it to generate the mesh. Remember last time I think it was something like 7 seconds. And so we're a little bit past that already. And now we get an error. And it says, oh, there's an error writing the mesh to the file output tutorial 2. And the problem is we've got it open inside of QGIS. So let's go ahead and remove that and then tell it to retry. And now it finished and it took 50 seconds. Of course, that part of that 50 seconds was us hitting the retry. And so now let's go back in. Oops, not what I wanted to do. Go back to our output and read in the new mesh. All right, so now if we turn on those lines, and I'm gonna just turn my fill to transparent, and we can see our lines following the channels and the roadways using the brake lines. And so that's a good way for us to force the mesh. We can see that, you know, along our channels we're getting cells that are elongated in the direction of flow. That's a way that's most efficient. The flows aren't changing very much laterally, so it's a good way to work with the model. Now there's a few different one last thing I wanted to look at. Those of you that are familiar with working with TUFLOW or TUFLOW-FV, you'll be familiar with the concept of check files. So check files are a way for us to verify that the inputs that we're providing to the model. We've used the same kind of setup in the in the GIS mesher, we have log files we can look at, and it'll tell us kind of what was happening, where we got our projection information, how many cells we generated, and some information like that, and the output files that we created. We created the shape file that we read in, also created a 2DM file. So those are things that the mesher set up and created for us. The other thing that we've got is these check files. So these check files tell us information about how the meshing was done. So for example, let's go down to this meshing 2. We can look in and see how it redistributed lines. Part of the process of generating the mesh is redistributing those lines to have the sizes that were assigned to them. And so if we go, we can add in we can put markers on every vertex, and we can see where the vertices are. And if we turn on the mesh, we can see that those are lining up with our mesh. So that's one of the things that we can check to make sure that things look right, is did our lines get redistributed in a way that makes sense and doesn't cause any problems. Another piece that's really useful in here is there's they call a background mesh. So if we look at the background mesh and background nodes, what this is all the information that we provided it based on the sizes of elements that we want. It took those points and triangulates them and interpolates between them to be able to size the mesh. So this gives us kind of some clue on how those mesh elements were defined. So we see, we've defined a lot near the channel, and then it just kind of expands out to these points along the edges. Now if we wanted it maybe a little bit more balanced and transition a little bit cleaner, maybe more points along the outside edge would help with that. And so that we would have, or maybe some in the intermediate part, would help to create triangles that were a little bit smoother. If we look at these attribute tables for the nodes, each node has a size in the primary direction, that's a size 0, a size in the secondary direction, that's a size 1, and then an angle. And so these points that we created around the outside, they're not directional. They don't enforce a specific direction. So they're just size 25 and 25 in both directions. In the ones that are along the channels, we can see, that they'll have 4 as a primary and 1.5 as the secondary, and then an angle. And so that angle will be kind of where based on how the polyline is turning at that time, where its direction is at that location in the polyline. So that's some tools that can help us to see how, so this video we covered setting up break lines. We used scaling to scale point elevations to get a little bit denser mesh. We can use that to make coarser meshes as well. It's a really powerful tool for being able to see if our mesh has adequate resolution, and we can just globally make 1.5 times more cells everywhere, or something like that, by using those cell multipliers, those size multipliers. We've gone through how to use break lines for lines that don't control the sizes, like we did with roads. And so those are some of the things that we needed to do. We talked about some of the check files, and we looked at the meshes. The next video in the series, we'll talk about some of the extra information that we can assign to the mesh: node strings, materials, and elevations. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the video and that you find the GIS mesher useful for creating good meshes quickly using your favorite GIS package.